Dale in for Jeff Munn.
KTAR Focus on Immigration.
We're hearing more from Governor Katie Hobbs, who's asked the federal government for $750 million to help prevent overwhelming conditions at the border. Our own Colton Krolak just caught up with her, and he joins us live with the latest.
The state needs the money to keep Arizonans safe, according to Governor Katie Hobbs. She says the border needs the funding, and fast.
We are at a crucial juncture. We've been able to completely avoid street releases in Pima County, and that could change if we don't get this investment. It is critical.
Hobbs is urging Congress to act on a continuing resolution, noting this was needed yesterday. Reporting live, Colton Krolak, KTAR News.
We recently spent 48 hours on the border with our partners at ABC15. Stay tuned for a special roundtable hosted by Jayme West and Javier Soto coming up next. The Lukeville, Arizona port of entry reopened January 4th after a month-long closure tied to the migrant surge. Hector Vasquez del Mercado, director of Las Palomas Resort in Puerto Penasco, told Arizona's Morning News they're still trying to recover from the tourism losses during the holidays.
This week has been better. We expect to be full this weekend and during the week around the 70%. So it's not bad.
Rocky Point, Mexico is about a 3.5 hour drive from Phoenix. We set a grim record last summer. More people than ever died from the heat. 645 people died from heat-related causes last year in Maricopa County. That's 50% more than the previous record. Maricopa County Public Health Medical Director Dr. Rebecca Sonnenschein.
What that tells us is that we all need to get together as a community and really address these preventable deaths.
She says that means increasing awareness and keeping cooling centers open for extended hours and weekends. A former MCSO detention officer will now get a taste of jail from the other side of the prison bars.
28-year-old Andres Salazar was sentenced to 2 years for smuggling meth and fentanyl into the Maricopa County Lower Buckeye Jail. Salazar was arrested as he arrived to work, where at the time, over 58 grams of meth and more than 100 fentanyl pills were discovered in his vehicle. Salazar pled guilty to 1 count of promoting prison contraband, which is defined as a Class 4 felony. 2 inmates were also indicted for their involvement in the matter. Patricia Valencia, KTAR News.
The 7th suspect arrested in connection to the death of Preston Lord pleaded not guilty this morning. 18-year-old Treston Billy turned himself in following the announcement of the other arrests. He's been charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated robbery. For the latest and complete coverage of youth violence in the East Valley, go to ktar.com/youthviolence. The Tempe City Council recently approved funding for programs that'll benefit neighborhoods vulnerable to the effects of climate change.
The $1.6 million in funding will create 3 programs with the goal of promoting community wealth building, equitable urban cooling, and resilience to extreme heat, according to Tempe Mayor Corey Woods. The funding will develop 2 public food forests using rainwater and start a tree steward program that will allow members of the community to oversee where the trees will be planted and provide skills training to maintain the growth. 3 Tempe neighborhoods, along with the town of Guadalupe, will be the focus of the efforts after being identified as disadvantaged and overburdened areas due to a lack of investment and pollution. Jessica Welch, KTAR News.
And now with a check of traffic, here's Chuck Rowe live in the Valley Chevy Dealers Traffic Center.
Thank you, Deborah. Things are moving pretty well around the valley. We do have a little slow spot on the I-17 southbound, just a little sluggish there between 7th Avenue and 7th Street. Same goes for the I-10 eastbound. If you're heading through the tunnel, you'll be tapping the brakes a little bit just through the tunnel. It's better once you get clear of that. We did have a stalled vehicle, US 60 westbound, a priest drive on the off-ramp. Looks like that has been cleared. Watch for police activity McDowell Road between 75th and 83rd Avenue. This traffic report brought to you by Carol Royce, your home sold guaranteed realty. Planning to sell your home? Carol Royce will give you a guaranteed cash offer at your price, or she'll pay you the difference. Learn more at higherprice.com. Chuck Rowe, KTAR News.
Don't be surprised if you see a raindrop or two today or maybe tomorrow. 30% chance of rain today and tomorrow. High today 71. High tomorrow, 68. Right now, 64 degrees in Phoenix. Weather brought to you by Howard Air. Whether replace or repair, call Howard Air. I'm Deborah Dale for Jeff Munn on Arizona's news station, KTAR News.
A KTAR News and ABC15 special roundtable on immigration. 48 hours on the border. KTAR News 92.3 FM and the KTAR News app.
Good afternoon. I'm Jayme West from Arizona's Morning News on KTAR, and thank you for joining me for this special roundtable along with ABC15 news anchor Javier Soto. And all week on both KTAR and ABC15, you've been hearing and seeing stories about the real people who actually live and work along Arizona's southern border. And we sent teams of reporters to spend 48 hours on the border, and they have come back with incredible and unique stories to tell.
Really, I think everybody you'll speak with today who went down to the border understands the importance of what we're doing here, 48 hours on the border, especially during an election year. But really, everybody came back and our eyes were open to what exactly is really going on at the border, including our two gentlemen here, Jim Cross with KTAR and our Ford Hatchett with ABC15. You guys spent some time with a rancher who is a fifth-generation rancher, has owned that property, a huge property, and sees the immigration issue firsthand each and every day.
Yeah. Jim Chilton, like you said, fifth-generation rancher, about 85 years old. Self-described cowboy, not a wimp. And he's a character. But he took us on a tour. Ford and myself rode on this. Took 5 hours probably?
Yeah, it was 4 hours, I think, just to get to the bottom half of his property.
Yeah, down that cow trail on the side of the mountain. And it was eye-opening from a number of reasons. The migrants that were, on the U.S. side of the border. He took us to an area where the border wall construction had stopped, but if you go west from there were gaps in the wall, some 100 feet wide, some 20, 25 feet wide. Some had vehicle barriers, other parts didn't have any vehicle barriers. But we saw dozens of migrants from several different countries down there.
And he's concerned because of the gaps on the barriers where his property lines up, which is like how many miles would you say?
A little over
5
5
border?
miles.
It's at 5 miles of the international boundary.
Right against the border, and the gaps there funnel migrants right onto his property, correct?
Yeah, and he was very compassionate toward the migrants. Absolutely no ill feelings toward them at all.
Well, so far as he's installed, I think it was 29 different water fountains on his property because he noticed that, and something tragically we saw, people have died on his property.
Like 35, migrants. Right?
35 since he's been there in 1987.
Wow.
But he found his cowboys. He has 5 cowboys. One of them found a body on, I think he said 2 or 3 years ago, and alerted him to that. But, and I can understand it. Even at this time of the year, it's brutal. I mean, it is some of the most remote country, rugged country I've been into in Arizona the whole time I've been here.
Ford, I know when he took you guys along for a ride down that border wall, there were encampments that you guys came across. What did you discover there?
It was people from all around the world. I mean, we spoke with people from Haiti, from India. I think there's El Salvador. And it was a camp. It was tents set up. Probably 2 dozen, maybe even 3 dozen people in that camp. Yeah. And a lot of them waiting when we first pulled up, hoping that we were Border Patrol, hoping that we would be able to apprehend at least some of the women and children, take them to a port of entry, and then they could begin their claim for asylum, right? They were waiting and hoping to be apprehended. And Jim, I know you were there too and saw it. It really kind of breaks your heart when you see these people who really have no idea where they are. Some of them saying they were told that Phoenix or Tucson was just a couple miles over the hill.
Yeah, Tucson's probably 60 miles from where we're at. But the cartels bring them across and say, right over the hill there, and it's not. And a person in good health, in good shape, to hike out of there would probably take days.
And we're talking families, too. You had a lady ask you if you had a baby bottle.
Yeah, we were in the truck, and she asked all of us if we just had a baby bottle. That's all she wanted. And then a lot of them asked if we had food or water. As Ford mentioned, they wanted to know if we were Border Patrol or we're going to see Border Patrol. Another thing I'll remember, somebody in the camp said that there were women and a kid walking west towards Sassabee. I think they were looking for food and water, and wanted to know if we could tell them to turn around, and Chilton did. because Sassabee would have been, probably 15 miles from where they were at.
Well, and at that point, too, as you walk along on that trail towards Sassabee, there are signs, little homemade signs put up that say, hey, you're 22 kilometers away. You're now 18 kilometers away, reminding these folks just how close they are. And it was 3 women and a child. It couldn't have been any more than 8 years old.
Yeah.
And they've already made quite a trek to get where they are, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And that was the one thing, and we're not crossing over to the other side of the wall, but Chilton, who's lived there for so long, says, everything he hears is that side is really, it's cartels that are kind of operating and dropping folks off at the wall and saying, you're on your own now. They've been paid their sum, and that's that.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, you touched on the fact that despite his frustration, he's still sympathetic to what these people are going through. Right. What is he calling for?
He wants the wall reconstruction to begin. I mean, to kick off again. He wants that border sealed. He wants technology put in there and sensors. He wants Border Patrol agents to be able to do their job, because right now a lot of them are doing administrative duties because, they're spread so thin that they don't have the numbers on the border. We did not encounter, at least on the border, any agents. Once we came out of Sassabee, we saw a couple. And
that was 5 hours. You were on this tour for 5 hours and didn't see one.
Well, and logistically, it creates a problem in of itself because it takes 4 hours to get there just through the rugged terrain. So if you're going to start a Border Patrol agent and start their day,
right?
You need 4 hours to get there and 4 hours to get back. If you're going to work an 8 or a 10-hour day, you're not even going to spend that much time at the border, even if you are assigned just specifically to that stretch.
And they're very spread out.
Yes.
Along the border because of the lack of resources.
Yeah, I mean, they've been doing other duties beyond what they are designed to do. He said he hasn't seen a Border Patrol agent on his property in 4 or 5 months, probably.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah.
And I saw a note here, Ford, you said that he told you he's been spending his own money to try and reinforce the barriers. How is he doing that?
Well, as Jim mentioned, there's a portion where the wall's construction was stopped, and after that, he said it took a few months, and then Homeland Security installed kind of these Normandy barriers. They're really vehicle barriers. He said it was a problem because not only were people coming across there, his cattle were going into Mexico. He had cattle from the other side coming onto his ranch, and so he said he'd spent thousands of dollars reinforcing it with rebar and then a metal pipe. He said the rebar initially he put in, and he would come down and find it bent back to create a path for people again. And that was something we noticed at a fence even on his property. There was a little makeshift gate that would block the way up on the road. And he says every time he drives down there, which is again about once a week to the southern end of his property, that gate's broken open. And he always comes out and repairs it himself.
How often does he make that drive down to his southernmost part of his ranch? I mean, this is a 50,000-acre ranch, right?
I would guess maybe once a week. Just guessing.
He mentioned it would either be about once a week or once every 2 weeks. So,
what you guys spoke with some of the immigrants there. What was their mentality? What were they asking for? Where were they going?
Go ahead.
I think it was confusion on a lot of the faces. Right? They had achieved the goal. They had made it across, and there was no solution. Most of them were walking to Sassabee, trying to find somewhere that would take them to the next step of their journey.
And there isn't much there.
No, it's a ghost town basically. There's a grocery store that's probably as big as this room. There's, I think, one gas pump. I think there's a post office and a school, and that's it. Most of the homes are empty. So.
And this is one of the areas that's highly crossed. One of the most crossed areas is on the way to Sassabee.
Like I said, it's some of the most remote area I've ever seen in this state. I mean, it's not like being outside of Douglas or Nogales or the Ajo area or Yuma, San Luis. This is, it's not the end of the earth, but you can see it from there.
And folks know, at the end of those border walls where those Normandy barriers are, there are nonprofits that'll come and leave blankets, food, water, knowing that migrants will be coming across.
Before we wrap up this segment and let you guys go, and thank you, by the way, so much for sharing your experiences there. What is the one takeaway that of your experience that you would want people to know?
I just say how complex of an issue it is. Jim's wife, Sue, actually compares it to The old parable of blind folks trying to touch an elephant and figure out what it is. One touches a tail and thinks it's a rope. One touches a leg and thinks it's a tree. And it depends on where you're looking at it. It really are so many different points to this, whether it's the wall or the camps that are there. There's no one-size-fits-all solution is the one thing that I would take away.
Yeah, I think takeaway for me was it really puts into clear light how ruthless the cartels are. To dump people in this area at this time of year is one thing. To do this in the summertime is brutal. And the look on their face that we talked about, it was confusion, it was fear, it was that they had wanted to come to the United States and they were left in the middle of nowhere. So it was an interesting trip down there.
KTAR's, yeah.
Eye-opening for them as well once they got there. And as you mentioned, there was no solution immediately.
KTAR's Jim Cross, ABC 15's Ford Hatchett, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience with us. As our roundtable discussion continues here on KTAR about the 48 hours on the border our team of reporters spent recently. I'm Jayme West from Arizona's Morning News on KTAR, along with ABC 15 news anchor Javier Soto, and we'll be right back.
From your neighborhood to the state capitol, wherever you are in Arizona, Arizona's breaking news and traffic is KTAR News on 92.3 FM. A KTAR News and ABC 15 special, 48 hours on the border.
Thanks for joining us as we continue our roundtable discussions with KTAR and ABC 15 reporters who recently spent 48 hours on our southern border. I'm Jayme West from Arizona's Morning News on KTAR, along with ABC 15 news anchor Javier Soto.
And we got off to a great start talking about Jim Cross and Ford Hatchett's visit to a ranch down in southern Arizona. I want to get to ABC 15 morning anchor Nick Saletti. He does a tremendous job for us. And what I love about your report now is you actually have a compare and contrast from when you were there about a year ago when Title 42 ended. We're going to get to that in a second, but we want to talk to you about your interview with the Border Patrol chief, because I think that's instrumental in this whole conversation. What was that conversation like, and what stood out to you the most about his description about what's going on there at the border?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for doing this, Jayme. We appreciate you hosting us, and we're so thrilled to be able to continue this discussion. Yeah, so you're right, Javi. I sat down with Sean McGoffin, who is the chief patrol agent for the Yuma sector of the Border Patrol. So that is 126 miles of southern border. It stretches from to the westernmost point, the Imperial Sand Dunes. So if you're familiar with the Yuma area, that part stretches into California. California, and then it goes east pretty much to the Yuma County, Pima County line. And one of the first things I asked, because we hit different points of the border, is, my goodness, the diversity of the terrain that you have to deal with, right? Because the sand dunes literally is sand. And then as you head east, you encounter the Colorado River. And then you get to rockier terrain as you head closer to that Pima County line. And just in talking to him about, well, how do you traverse that and how do you handle that? And they said, well, we have all different kinds of vehicles. Of course, they have boats even that they can use when they're out tracking things or out to interdict different things. I did ask him, point blank, do you think this is a crisis, right? Because that is a phrase that we hear commonly, that this is a crisis at the border. He didn't answer that per se, but what he did say to me is that he is alarmed by what he's seeing, and that he knows other sectors are alarmed by what they are seeing as well.
Interesting. And so you actually did a ride along with the sheriff then?
No, so we didn't do a ride along with the Border Patrol, but we did a sit down with them. But what we did on our own was we hit different points of the border.
Okay.
So, or that area generally. So again,
did you notice a difference between those different points of the border and the different terrain and the migrants that you may have encountered?
So we only encountered migrants, I would say, closer to the Yuma area, sort of near the Somerton, San Luis. Mm-hmm. There is an area where the fence, the wall doesn't continue there. So that's a common spot where folks will congregate and come over. And that was also an area that we went to in May of last year when Title 42 was ending. So we thought, let's go back there because we want to see, kind of compare and contrast, what is it like?
And what was the difference, or was there a difference compared with last May?
Yeah, I mean, with Title 42 ending, we were there the day before it ended and then the day after. And as you know, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners know, it was like night and day. So right before Title 42.
Let's explain Title 42 real quick.
Absolutely. So Title 42 was that pandemic-era executive action that was put into place under former President Donald Trump to try to slow down the flow of migrants. And it was seen as a public health order. And that was, at the time, seen as a way to try to slow the spread of COVID. Now, because of the way our immigration system is, it was sort of used as a way to kind of, again, slow the flow of migrants in, right? Because we've been tracking these on-again, off-again surges. But it went away at the end of mid-May of last year because as the pandemic has wrapped up, they felt as though it needed to go away. So that was ending. So what we saw down there in Yuma was sort of a mad dash to get in before it ended. And then the next day after it ended, it was, like I said, night and day. We didn't really see that many people at all. Now, that wasn't to say that there wasn't any. But over the past year, just to give you guys some context, the folks that I know in Yuma have told me here and there, they have seen these surges where they'll go a couple weeks where they're in the middle of it, and then it's quiet again for a couple months, and then for a few more weeks they'll have another surge.
It's interesting too because we'll kind of get a heads up deeper into Mexico of a large group traveling together, heading for the U.S. border.
Yeah.
And then a week or two later, here they are.
Yeah, Jayme, you're right, because in my conversation with the chief patrol agent of the Yuma sector for Border Patrol, he said they have technology there. They have partners in Mexico that are keeping them abreast of what is happening, what the trends are, what the paths are. Because that's another thing too. Is these are people we're talking about, right? So things are always changing. So right now, when I was in Yuma, they're not really experiencing much of a surge right now. I mean, they're still seeing a lot of people. Don't get me wrong. The numbers are still up from what they were in, let's say, 2020. But the Tucson sector right now is really what's experiencing a surge. So what happens in cases like that is they will bring people over so the Yuma sector can help process them too. So it's kind of like a team effort, right? If one is feeling the strain right now, then the other sector is going to hop in and help them out where they can.
Despite not seeing the surge that we saw back in December, where Border Patrol reported record-breaking apprehensions of 250,000 people plus, you were still seeing busloads of people showing up who were seeking asylum. They were processed and then they were going elsewhere.
Yeah, Javi, that's such a good point because, you think about even one busload of people, and to give you guys some context, it was about 50 people on a bus. So if you think about that, that's still 50 individuals, 50 humans that are coming over that need a place to go. So we were at what happens is after the migrants are they're background checked, they're screened, they're fingerprinted, they're photographed, I believe. There's a whole process that they go through. And they told me that pretty quickly they're able to decipher whether someone is allowed to be here or not, meaning is there any kind of criminal record, meaning is there some kind of prior immigration violation that would mean that they're not able to be here right now. Because there's a waiting period where if you've been removed, you can't come back for a certain amount of time. So they said pretty quickly they're able to determine that. After that, if they find out someone is, let's say, making an asylum request, well, the way that our laws are set up, they legally have the right to do that. So there's a whole process for that. We mentioned the background checks and whatnot. But from there, the Border Patrol legally has to release them after that. And then there's a whole process. There's court dates that they would need to show up for, or maybe a report by date where they have to report to immigration officials from there.
So I really want to hear about your experience on the bus.
Sure.
And I really want to hear about the Regional Center for Border Health, which I know nothing about, and I would love to be educated on. And I'm sure our listeners aren't familiar with what this place is. So will you join us for the next segment as well, so we can talk more about it? All right. Thanks so much. Nick Saletti with ABC15, Javier Soto with ABC15 also joining me. I'm Jayme West from KTAR's Arizona's Morning News. You're listening to a roundtable discussion of 48 hours on the border.
a KTAR News and ABC15 special roundtable on immigration. 48 hours on the border.
Good afternoon. I'm Jayme West from Arizona's Morning News on KTAR, and he is ABC 15 News anchor Javier Soto. So glad you could be here to do this roundtable. Our station's teamed up to bring you a unique look at the border crisis, sending teams of reporters to Arizona's southernmost regions for 48 hours. And you've been hearing and watching their stories all week on our stations. Now we're digging a little deeper.
Yeah, it's important to talk about what we discovered and versus what we're hearing constantly, especially from the political realm. So I want to turn our attention right now to ABC 15 Mornings. Nick Saletti does an incredible job for us. And one of the things that stood out to me about your report when you were talking and focused on the Regional Center for Border Health, because if not for them, once these immigrants are processed, Border Patrol essentially releases them. If not for the Regional Center for Border Health, they'd just be wandering the streets.
What is this regional center? Because I am completely unfamiliar with it. In all of the border stories we've covered, this did not stand out. So, but plays a very important part.
It certainly does. And, Jayme, that's actually for a reason, because I'll get just a little background here. I worked in Yuma about 15 years ago. Okay. So I knew the Regional Center for Border Health. It's in Somerton, which is just outside of Yuma. It's still in Yuma County. But essentially, at their core, it's a network they have 17 clinics in rural parts of Arizona. So in Yuma County, I believe in Mojave County as well, different parts of rural Arizona. It was a system of basically health clinics. They have a public health mission, okay? But 3 years ago, when we started seeing these surges, they were approached to establish essentially a transition center, okay? So they've made this transition center. What happens is after the migrants are, like we said, processed and screened and background checked by the Border Patrol, legally they cannot hold them anymore, so they need to go somewhere. So what the regional center did was they created this transition center where the Border Patrol agents can bring them, and from there they can get food, water. It's not an overnight shelter, but the goal is for the Regional Center for Border Health to then help them book travel arrangements to stay with friends and family as they await this asylum process. And the Regional Center tells me they're not paying for people's flights or anything like that. The migrants are still responsible for that, but they're basically just the next step in the journey to help them get to where they need to be. But to your points earlier, if not for them, these migrants would be released on the streets. And we've seen that in Yuma. We've seen that in other Arizona border towns before.
Their background is health. And one of the things you pointed out in your report is they go through a health screening.
Yeah, they get COVID tested. Yeah, right. Because even though we're now 4 years into this, COVID is not still totally eradicated, right? So it's important for them to still do that. But Javier, you're absolutely right. At their core, it's a public health mission. So they still want to make sure that they are doing that.
And what about the children? What happens with the children? Are they provided a place to continue their education? I mean, I know we've had a lot of unaccompanied minors come across the border, and I'm just trying to figure out what happens with them to try and create some normality in their life until they figure out where they're going and what they're going to do with them.
Yeah, because if you think about how disruptive it is for an adult, right?
Right.
But then you think of this through the eyes of a child.
Exactly.
And I saw a lot of children. I did not see any unaccompanied, though. What I was seeing were families, but I mean, I was seeing babies. I mean, what looked like infants to teenagers and really everything in between. I think that just depends on where they're going from here. For the folks that were requesting asylum, I'll tell you, for one example, I met a family who was going to Oklahoma, and it was a mom and two kids, two teenagers. So I don't know what exactly will happen to them from there, but that's another layer to this, right? I mean, there's so many different factors of, what happens when you are, arrive.
Do they have a sponsor there or somebody that they have been in contact with?
Essentially, yeah. So the idea is that after these folks get released, and then the Regional Center for Border Health helps them get to where they need to go. They provide free busing from Somerton up to Sky Harbor so they can take flights. Obviously, Sky Harbor is a much larger airport than the Yuma airport is, so there's more options. But yeah, they would go to stay with a friend or family. The folks that I would talk to, kind of all of the above. I met one person, we were talking during the break about me on the bus. So I met a gentleman who was from Guatemala, and he was staying with relatives, I think cousins and an uncle in LA. So he was taking the bus up from Yuma to Sky Harbor so he could fly to LA, stay with them as this asylum process plays out.
So you got on the bus in Somerton.
I did.
And you rode with this group of migrants all the way to Sky Harbor Airport.
I did, yeah. So it's about a 3.5-hour bus ride. The bus wasn't quite full. It was probably about 30 migrants on there, and just tried to talk to some of them. And I got talking to one gentleman who was about 27. He was coming from Guatemala, and he had left behind his wife and his young daughter. And the reason why he wanted to come here was to work. And I mean, we were hearing it ran the gamut. I mean, a lot of the folks that we spoke to were trying to escape violence and gang activity and the cartels. But they were also talking about the lack of economic opportunities in their country.
Let me really quickly. How many of those stories do you think that that's what they felt they needed to say to seek asylum? Or were they actually coming from those type of violent situations?
Yeah, that is a common question that we get. It's hard to tell, but what I will say is in so many of these people, you see the pain, you see the fear, you see the anguish in their eyes, and you can almost feel it from their hearts when you talk to them. And I know that this is a very hot button issue, and there's all different kinds of opinions, but stripping away the politics of this for now and just being a human and hearing these things, or talking to people. I met one mom who says she was robbed 6 times in Mexico. Or the gentleman that you were talking about on the bus coming from Guatemala, he told me that he didn't sleep for 2 nights because he was shivering so much in the desert that he would go to sleep and he would wake up and just be shaking. So you hear those things and you think about what people are willing to risk. I mean, we've covered this before. People die on this journey. This is a dangerous journey. So you think about what people are willing to risk. And you have to realize that they're doing this for a reason, and there's something that they're trying to escape.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, at any point, did you ask them if they were aware of the controversy of them coming here to the United States and what's being told to the American people here by some folks?
Yeah, a couple of them I asked, and I said, what would you say to the people who think that you shouldn't be here, or the people upset that they assume that you're using our resources or something like that. We all hear the
jumping
rumors
to the head of the line using the asylum factor, right?
Right. And so many of them told me they felt like this was their only option, and they time after time told me, we're not here to take advantage, we're not here to cause any issues, we want to work, we want to build a better life, we want our chance at the American dream. Essentially is what they said.
What an incredible experience. Your big takeaway from this, I'm sure it had to be an experience of a lifetime for you to spend that time down there.
Yeah, Jayme, I'll say this. I mean, having lived and worked in Yuma before, being here, going back last year, every time I go, you learn something new, and you just see every situation is different. No one person is coming for the same reason.
ABC 15's Nick Saletti, thank you so much for joining us. Incredible stories. I'm Jayme West from KTAR's Arizona's Morning News, along with ABC 15 news anchor Javier Soto. We are hosting a roundtable on our team effort of sending reporters down to the border for 48 hours, and we're hearing their incredible stories. So keep it here on KTAR.
Dave Ramsey here.
A KTAR News and ABC15 special, 48 Hours on the Border.
Good afternoon. I'm Jayme West from Arizona's Morning News on KTAR. Joining me for this special roundtable is ABC15 News anchor Javier Soto.
All week, both KTAR and ABC15, you've been hearing and seeing stories about the real people who actually live and work along Arizona's southern border. We sent teams of reporters to spend 48 hours on the border. They've come back with incredible and very unique stories to tell about what's really happening on the border.
And one of them is KTAR's Ballin Overstolz. You went down to Douglas, correct?
Yeah, KTAR news reporter Heidi Hommel and myself and people from ABC15 as well. We all went to Douglas, Arizona.
And Javier, you went down to Douglas as well, right?
We met two veterans who have lived their entire lives in Douglas, Arizona. And
where is Douglas for people who aren't familiar with Arizona's southern border?
It is about 15 minutes. It's right on the border. It's on the southern part of the border. It's right across from Agua Prieta, Mexico.
So southeastern Arizona.
Southeastern Arizona.
Okay.
We met these two veterans, and they told the story about what life was like before they had border fencing, when they were kids, and how there wasn't a border that existed because they were just part of Mexico and playing with those kids out in the fields and playing baseball.
So basically, there was, you said a barbed wire fence there, but it was just basically marked the line between the U.S. and Mexico because for the families and the kids living there in those two border cities, there was no line, right, Ballin?
Yeah, they even said Hector and Felipe, the two people I spoke to down there, they talked about how when people crossed that line, they didn't think about going into a foreign country. They said when they would go visit Agua Prieta, they didn't think they were going into a foreign country.
And when did things start changing for them, and how much has it changed?
So the indication we got is it's been a slow dynamic change. How it used to be, going further back to the 50s and 40s, this is going back to their childhood, the dynamic was people would come over for the day, work in the day, and go back home. What has happened, slowly over those decades is that people don't want to come and work for the day. They have longer term plans for when they want to come to the United States, and that puts a strain on communities like Douglas.
Douglas, I know that we've talked to the Cochise County Sheriff before, and he's talked about Douglas, not really. There's no bus service. There are no resources to take care of the migrants that are coming into that small town. Well, first of all, I should have you describe what this town is like. It's a very small town, right?
Yeah. Anybody familiar with Arizona small towns? I used to live in Globe. Towns like that, right? A lot of history, a lot of old buildings. They're beautiful to walk around and look around. But yeah, there's not a lot of services there. Surely, things like, and I should say there is a transportation service, but it's not going to go out of the city of Douglas where a lot of these migrants want to go. So yes, very small scale.
It's a town of less than 16,000 people. And to give you a little history, so about 40 years ago, it was known as a smelter town because of the proximity to the mines. When the smelter closed down, that basically erased most of their economy. So this is a city that's hanging on by the thread. In fact, they rely heavily on the cross-border connection, the people coming into Douglas to shop there. They said 80% of their tax revenue is based on Agua Prieta.
And the men that you talked to, they said they really were defending the reputation of Douglas and inviting people to come and check it out, right?
Yeah, that was one of their biggest takeaways, what they wanted us to know. And first, to go back to what you said, Javier, very quickly about the border being important to the economy of Douglas, they view the discussion of closing the border that we've seen come from some lawmakers, flat out, they see that as a threat because that would devastate a community like Douglas. But going to what you said, Jayme, I'm sorry, can you remind me your question?
They wanted to defend their reputation as a border town.
Absolutely. That was one of the biggest things they wanted us to take away from that conversation. I know Felipe told me people come down with this perception that they're going to see people running around with guns and drugs out and people moving drugs out in public. If you go to Douglas, you probably won't see migrants, really.
And what's interesting is they pointed out they're about 15 minutes away from Bisbee. Bisbee is a huge tourism town, so people come to Bisbee, yet they don't come down to Douglas. And I have to tell you, and I know where we did the interview, the Gadsden Hotel is the most amazing hotel you've seen in the state of Arizona. The stairway is gorgeous and elegant. In fact, they've used it in the Oscars as an Oscar opening years before, but this is an incredible part of Arizona's history. Douglas used to be one of the bigger cities in Arizona back in the early 1900s.
Right, in the mining days.
Yeah, beautiful buildings. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of business, and most of these buildings are boarded up.
Ballin, you glad you visited Douglas and learned a little bit more about some Arizona history maybe you didn't know before?
Yeah, I'm incredibly glad, and I really think more people should go check it out. And to say really quick, I grew up in Yuma, so it was kind of a return from home. It was a reminder that border towns are beautiful and diverse and great places.
All right. Thank you very much. KTAR's Ballin Overstolz joining us about his visit down to Douglas. And we have plenty more to talk about coming up here on the roundtable. With KTAR and ABC15, we've teamed up for a special called 48 Hours on the Border. We sent teams of reporters to the border for 48 hours, and now they are here sharing their incredible stories. And it's just fascinating stuff. Thank you so much. Keep it here on KTAR.
a KTAR News and ABC15 special roundtable on immigration. 48 hours on the border. KTAR News 92.3 FM and the KTAR News app.
Thank you for joining us as we continue our roundtable discussion with both KTAR and ABC15. We've had reporters who recently spent 48 hours on the border. ABC15's anchor Javier Soto. I'm joined by KTAR's Jayme West from Arizona's Morning News. And I don't know about you, but I've been wowed so far just hearing these stories that have come back.
It's so interesting just to sit around and have conversations about these experiences. I'm absolutely loving this, and I'm learning a lot. You know, even as an Arizona native, there's so many things to discover, especially now. Things have changed a lot since I was a kid. And to hear about the experiences along the border during this crisis and how things have changed has been absolutely fascinating.
We are joined by ABC15's Patricio Espinoza. He was one of the only reporters allowed to go into Mexico, approved by the company for obvious reasons, the danger and everything that, that is frightening about crossing that border. But Patricio, you went into Mexico. What did you discover when you went into that country?
Yeah, well, first of all, Jayme, Javier, thank you so much for having me here, for having us here. It's a pleasure. It's been an adventure ever since I set foot at ABC15 only a month and a half ago.
They're keeping you busy.
And you're an immigrant yourself.
I'm an immigrant myself.
Okay.
Yes, I've been in this country more than half of my life. I came here when I was 17, and I follow the process. I'm a U.S. citizen, and I contribute to our community through journalism. That's my work.
So what did you find as you crossed back across the border into Mexico?
Well, the first thing that you notice that anyone will see when you cross the borders is you walk in and boom, there it is. There's a line of people that are waiting.
And where was this at?
This is in Nogales.
Okay.
So the Nogales is the only port of entry in the entire Arizona-Mexico border where you can actually where if you have an appointment to seek asylum, that is the only port of entry that you can go to. There's about 1,500 appointments that can be made a day throughout the entire U.S. Mexico border. And whether those are granted or not, that's where you go. So, yeah, that's Nogales, Mexico, Nogales, Sonora. And that's what you notice. It's this line of people. Some are daily crossers. They have daily work permits. They come back and forth. Others are waiting in line just to be called, waiting for their number.
And one of the things you discovered about those people waiting is sometimes they're waiting weeks, they're waiting months, and they're essentially homeless on that side.
Yes. So what happens is that you get a number. Let's just say you get number 100, and then you keep monitoring that number. So if they are in number 10, you have 90 to go, so you may be able to go to a shelter. There's several in the area. But if you're getting down to, say, number 80, then you know that you're like 3 days away for your number to be called. So you better be there. Because if they say, oh, Señor Javier Soto, are you here? And there's no answer, you got to go back. You got to apply again. But you lose your place. So these people, yes, Javier, they're there. They're waiting sometimes for months and then for days right at the line, often with a shelter.
And many times these people have come from a very long way away. So it's not like they can just turn around and go home and then come back later. The resources alone, as far as money that would cost and the time as well, especially for those claiming asylum, they don't want to go back home. That's the reason they're here. So what are they doing as they're waiting?
Well, imagine that, if I may just go back there for a second to your statement. I met a family from Venezuela. That's about 3,000-something miles. That's where they started their journey back in November. It wasn't until February that they made it. And you don't just jump right over. You have to go through 7 countries, 7 borders. And every time you cross a border, something happens. They were lucky, blessed, that Nothing more than people taking their money happened. But it was a single mother, 34 years old, 34 years old, and 2 kids, a girl 12 years old and a little boy 8 years old. And they made it through. So they're waiting because in Venezuela, according to them, there's just nothing for them. There's no resources. There's not good medical aid. There's not a future for the kids. And that was the first thing I asked her. Why did you do this? And right away, my children. Children.
What were the conditions of the children? Because you figure they've come from far, 3,000 plus miles. What were the conditions of the children?
It's amazing. You sometimes it's like bless the innocent of a child, Javier. So one of the kids, 8-year-old Fabian, he's out there, he's playing soccer and all that. And I just went out and I say, hey, Fabian, how you doing? I'm doing good. I asked him, why did you come? Well, because I want to come to the United States. You do. Why? Because they pay better. He's been hearing all these things.
Right.
And I asked him, well, do you know what the United States is? And it was like that, a little silence. He couldn't really explain. Is it a country? And it's just, those, if that may or may not answer your question, but they're just so innocent that at this time, he doesn't know any better. Maybe 10, 20 years from now, he will have something back then or experiences that he may not want to remember. He did remember that they were robbed, that they took money from them, but luckily
frightening
nothing
for a
else.
kid, huh?
Yeah.
Even for an adult. We're talking to ABC 15's Patricio Espinoza, and you actually were one of the reporters that was allowed to go across the border and talk to the people who are awaiting their entry into the U.S. and sometimes living on the streets with their families. What kind of conditions are they living in? I mean, is there anybody helping them at all as far as bathing and eating and drinking?
Yeah, well, there are different groups, and about the only thing they have going for them is that at least they can communicate across the border, because everybody obviously speaks Spanish, so then maybe they can find resources, ask questions, but still, a lot of the people come from very humble backgrounds, and they just are not as resourceful that one of us may be. So there's a group that have been able to find shelter, usually run by religious organizations, by the municipality of Nogales, volunteers, social workers. So I met a pastor from Phoenix, Ramon Montoya. He used to go there every other weekend with his wife. They finally say, we can't sustain this anymore. So he moved there. And through donations, he's been able to build 2 shelters, one to help those with addiction, another one for children. And some of the people that say graduate from these addiction centers, or some people that find healing through his services, they turn out to be volunteers that work at these shelters. The shelter is owned by the city of Nogales, but it is volunteers and this pastor that helps them run them. The other side are people out on the street, and every Wednesday they go out with coffee, soup, burritos, and they give this to the people out on the streets, especially those waiting in line. And you just have to see the smiles when they get a cup of coffee.
And that really stood out to me in one of your stories, the description of watching a woman who had been waiting months get a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
What was that like to see that? Obviously, she hadn't had coffee, possibly nothing, for days, but that one cup of coffee made a difference.
Well, as a reporter, I'm there gathering information, gathering the facts, recording these stories, this people's stories. But there are times, when I was talking to Fabian, I had to take a deep breath because it was just...
It's so hard not to get emotionally engaged.
And I'm not a father.
Human to human, right?
But exactly. And that's the situation with this whole thing.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
Just wonderful that you're able to express it and bring other people into your experience and share it with all of us. So thank you very much. Patricio Espinoza from ABC 15. We sent teams of reporters, KTAR reporters and ABC 15 reporters, down to our southern border for 48 hours, and they are sharing their stories with us here on KTAR. I hope you'll stay with us. We'll be right back.
KTAR News 92.3 FM and the KTAR News app.
And thank you so much for joining us as we continue our roundtable discussions with KTAR and ABC15 reporters who recently spent 48 hours on the border. I'm Jayme West from Arizona's Morning News on KTAR, along with ABC15 anchor Javier Soto.
And Jayme, we spent 48 hours on the border, not only ABC15, but also Scripps News. So we covered all of the border. We covered Texas, California, as well as Arizona. And I want to bring in our newest reporter here for ABC15, Lillian Donahue. We are excited to have her. I think I just shared a story with you a second ago. When she started, and I'm talking like weeks into the job, they said, hey, we're sending you down to the border. And when we went into our first meeting, she says, I talked to this person, I got this set up, and I said, oh, okay, Lillian came to play. Let's play. So, Lillian, I know your focus was more economics in Nogales, where Patricio went into Mexico. Yeah. You focused on the importance of that relationship, that cross-border relationship with Nogales.
Certainly, right? When we talk about this border, situation, everything going on, there's a lot of talk about security, and that's really important. What's also really important are the two countries that rely on each other. It's a symbiotic dance that Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora have every single day. I think I put together kind of like a tagline. What is a bus driver, a pallet worker in a warehouse, and a top business executive all have in common? Well, they all have to cross through the DeConcini port of entry every single day for work, or the Mariposa port of entry for work. And it's either they're going into Mexico or they're coming into the United States. And that's the legal aspect of, how these communities rely on these cross-border workers. I mean, thousands of them every single day. There was 10 million people that crossed into the United States alone. We're not even talking those going into Mexico, but into the U.S. alone through the ports in Nogales. That's just showing how important that crossing is and what that kind of relationship looks like between the two communities. And it was really cool having those stories.
So why did they do it?
Well, a lot of different reasons, right? So economics is the first one, right? So you have people, the bus driver that I talked to, he crosses every single day at 6 a.m. and he makes 3 different crosses with this bus to pay, for his family, to help his family back in Sonora. And obviously that money goes both in the U.S. and Mexico since it's an international company. However, for him, it was a family-related thing. And he's like, I give up my Christmases, I give up my holidays, right? The border doesn't shut down for that kind of stuff. So obviously you have family. Then, I spoke with Joshua Rubin, who's in charge of the Port Authority kind of association looking at all of this. And he's a business executive in the maquila industry. And his side is really interesting. He goes into Mexico to foster those relationships. That's why he does it. He says it's what puts food on his table, and just a lot of those types of stories, those personal stories of folks that use it every single day. He said, what the warehouse worker I spoke with, he has a soccer league, football league down in Sonora that he goes to like twice a week or something like that, just after work. He's in Rio Rico, Arizona. Let me just go take my little commute down. Let's go play some soccer and then come back. So rich stories there about the economy. And there's really so much that I couldn't squeeze into a 3-minute.
You said Nogales relies on that cross-border relationship
Completely.
Because 70% of their sales revenue come from Mexico.
Yeah, so it's not just the workers themselves, it's the businesses that rely on shoppers to come over. It doesn't take long for you to stand near DeConcini and watch people come in and out with shopping bags. They're coming into the U.S. Some folks, are coming in to get groceries on the U.S. side and go back. I spoke with a man who, his side hustle was to come in the U.S., get groceries, go back into Mexico and make tamales and sell them. And that was his kind of thing. But I also spoke with a business owner who is right across, you can touch the border wall from his front door. And he says the large majority of his customers are Mexican customers that come up. And he relies on that kind of fluidity of the border every single day for his well-being, for his livelihood, for these business that's been here for almost 80 years.
And with record numbers of encounters along our southern border in fiscal 2023, how has this changed their lives, or has it?
Yes and no is the best way I can explain that. So when I was talking to folks, it was it hasn't changed those lives who are, they have their steady job, they're working it, they're living it, that's kind of what they're doing. Where it impacts folks, though, is when resources for public security end up being pulled to other parts. Nogales has been pretty well insulated because it's so important for our $28.6 billion trade through the port. However,
it's our number one trading partner.
Completely.
Yeah.
So Nogales has been pretty well insulated when it comes to resources. There's a lot of resources in Nogales. But, like we saw in Lukeville, right? So when that port was shut down, resources were pulled to other parts of in between the ports, right, to secure that. And so there's a worry from some folks that I spoke with. Well, if it gets worse, do we, could a port, yeah, could they pull resources from our port? They haven't felt that impact yet. That's just something they don't want to see in the future.
But with the bigger crowds, too, the waits to cross back and forth have to be taken into account, correct?
And that's exactly something that, I couldn't fit into that 3.5-minute story that I was able to do. But in order to continue this huge trade that we have going, all of these jobs that rely on our border as an opportunity in and of itself, a connecting structure rather than a dividing structure, you have to have fluid mobility through it, right? So, some folks, I was talking to director of Index, with Maquilas down in Sonora, and, he's like, well, we have a great relationship with the U.S. We love working with Arizona companies, but we want to get more trucks out. We want to get more stuff north. And, when you have a few lanes shut down at Mariposa or in DeConcini, it's hard. Right. And so I think that's the next step, is to modernize and make it easier for those who are trying to do their jobs to bring stuff over.
And we saw the same thing in Douglas because they're looking at expanding their port. And that was one of the things that they feared, that with the escalating immigration and the surges that we saw would be similar to what we saw in Lukeville, where they closed that port. It devastated both sides of that border, those border towns, especially when you look at like Rocky Point. And so they were fearful that if this escalates, if this continues with no solution, that eventually they're going to close those ports, and both sides of the border heavily rely on each other.
And Lillian, thank you very much. Speaking of Douglas, KTAR's Heidi Hommel made a trip to Douglas as part of our 48 Hours on the Border, and she spoke with the county commissioner in Cochise County, talking about the drain on resources for this small community. Huge. We'll have more on that coming up in just a few minutes as we continue our roundtable 48 Hours on the Border with KTAR and ABC 15 News.
a KTAR News and ABC15 special roundtable on immigration. 48 hours on the border.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Javier Soto from ABC15 News. We are continuing this roundtable discussion with KTAR as well as our ABC15 reporters who recently spent 48 hours on the border. I am joined by KTAR's Jayme West.
From Arizona's Morning News, I'm so glad you've hung with us here through this roundtable. I mean, it hasn't been hard because this has been just fascinating conversation, hearing about the experiences of our teams of reporters as they spent 48 hours on the border and sharing their experiences, which is basically going beyond the stories you've been hearing and seeing all week on both KTAR and ABC15. We wanted to dig a little deeper. So joining us is KTAR's Heidi Hummel. You were in Cochise County, Douglas specifically, right? And taking a look at how strapped these small communities are for resources without any federal help. And yet the feds are bringing the migrants to them, right?
Yes, we went down to Douglas, and one of our first interviews there was with Cochise County Supervisor Ann English. And she told us that the community in Douglas, they're empathetic to these migrants, but they're growing frustrated because when they cross over illegally in that section of the border, Border Patrol will, they claim asylum to Border Patrol, and then they're brought into Douglas to be processed. And now there's not a lot of resources in Douglas. It's a very small town. So from there, they're then bused from a state-funded bus program to Phoenix or Tucson, a larger transportation hub, to go stay with a sponsor and wait for their asylum hearing.
And one of the things we discovered, because we were also in Douglas, is, to what Heidi said, there are no resources. So essentially, when they get to Douglas, I mean, I know I mentioned this earlier, this is a town that is cash-strapped. There's not a huge economy there. So they don't have the resources, but more importantly, they don't have the transportation. So they don't have an Uber, they don't have bus lines, they don't have railways, they don't have airports. So when these migrants are sent to Douglas, there's nowhere for them to go. There's no jobs there. There's no resources. There's no food. So they stay in this Catholic church, usually for 24 to 48 hours, and then the state has to bring a bus in to bus them out to bigger cities.
What kind of solutions is the county and are the cities working on or hoping for?
Right now, Supervisor English said she's just worried about funding because, as a Board of Supervisors member, she's in charge of the budget. So she said the bus program, or actually talked to Dima, has in charge of the state-funded bus program, and it's secure through the rest of this fiscal year. But end of June, unless there's more money, they're worried about, what if those migrants aren't bussed out of Douglas? The community's worried, what if the buses stop coming?
And they're relying heavily on nonprofits as well, right?
Correct. So from Douglas, a lot of them are brought to Casa Alitas in Tucson. And I spoke to the executive director there, Diego Pina Lopez, and he does a lot of work helping these migrants. But he told me that he receives federal funding, and that federal funding is set to run out April 1st, which is in a few weeks. And after that, Border Patrol will no longer bring the migrants to Casa Alitas in Tucson. They're going to drop them off somewhere around the Greyhound bus station in Tucson.
You know what we found interesting, and again, these migrants are being bused to Douglas. But when we were asking, as far as people like jumping over the fence or coming in illegally, they said it typically doesn't happen. That's not to say it doesn't happen at all, but it typically doesn't happen. In fact, when we were there, our ABC15 crew saw 3 men climb over the wall. They were captured. They were taken into custody. But they said that these migrants, they have their specific routes, and they know that if they reach Douglas, there's nothing there for them.
So that may be the reason that they're not seeing the influx that other parts of Cochise County are, or other parts of the border are as well. So do they have a plan once this fiscal year ends?
No, there's no plan in place right now.
And then what? I mean, are they calling on the governor, or what are they
Well, Supervisor English, she said that, it's a federal problem, which we've heard time and time again. And she was actually mad at Congress. She said President Biden does not have the authority to close the border. And even if he did, that would be detrimental to the town of Douglas. If you shut down the port of entry, you shut down the economy in Douglas. So she really called on Congress to enact legislation. She was upset that the bipartisan border bill in the Senate didn't pass.
Similar to what Lillian just described in that relationship with Nogales. So
the cross-border relationship between Agua Prieta and Douglas is a lot like Nogales, Mexico, and Nogales,
very
Arizona.
Important. 80% of their sales tax revenue come from Mexico. So they rely on that. We spoke with a gentleman who is a naturalized citizen. He comes from Mexico. He comes into Douglas to work each and every day. And I asked him, what would happen if they close this port of entry? He said, my life would be devastated. I asked him why he came into the United States to work, and he said, it's simple. He said, the wages are much higher here. Interestingly enough, in contrast to that, we had a gentleman who was a U.S. citizen, is now living in Agua Prieta, sells Mexican treats just on the other side of the border. We said, why did you move into Mexico? He says, I born and raised in the United States. He says, I now have a pension, and that pension goes a lot further if I'm in Mexico.
Right. And there are a lot of retirees from the U.S. There are whole colonies, actually. San Carlos, Mexico, and that whole area that are, what do they call them, expatriates? Or
on that side?
Yeah.
I believe so.
Yeah, the U.S. Retirees that are living down there and enjoying the good life on the beach. But
with the margarita in hand.
With the margarita in hand. But that is one side, positive side of what we're seeing at the border is the ability for Americans to still travel there and for, the Mexican people to still travel into the U.S. to enjoy vacations or go shopping and things. But the surge of migrants at the border, you had some numbers for us, Javier, about what?
In December alone, and that was the highest monthly total on record. There were 250,000 encounters with migrants crossing into the United States. Now, that dropped in January, according to the Border Patrol, to 124,000. And it was very similar in the month of February, but that was 128,000 plus. But these are the types of numbers that when you see the surge, these are numbers, especially when you look at December, that had never been seen before.
And hugely impacting places like Douglas, right, Heidi?
Yes, and Diego in Tucson told me that he started seeing a lot more migrants coming to Casa Alitas after Title 42 ended.
Let me turn on my mic here. Interesting. So what was your big takeaway from Douglas? What did you come away there thinking people need to know about this?
My big takeaway, we keep hearing this word crisis. It's a border crisis, right? And I asked Ann English directly, is it a crisis? And she didn't give me a direct answer either, not a yes or a no. But she said she thinks a crisis is something that's uncontrollable and that this is being controlled but not by us. And so coming back from Douglas, I didn't see a border crisis in Douglas. There's no visible presence of migrants there, but they are there. But I think listening to everyone else's stories from 48 Hours on the Border and the other reporters at ABC15, when you put the collective of the stories together, it does certainly look like a crisis to me.
Thank you very much. And we have just loved listening to your story and to the explanation. To actually send journalists down and not have an angle, just to see for ourselves what's actually happening there, what people are going through who live and work there, what it's like for them on a daily basis, not just, a 2-hour visit by, a politician, but to actually talk to the people who are dealing with this on a daily basis. It's just been very fascinating to listen to. So thank you very much.
And
that is
and to take these 48 hours and, to get a broader perspective of what we did, not only ABC 15, but Scripps, all you have to do is go to abc15.com/border. All the stories are right there on the main page.
As well as KTAR.com if you want to see and hear more of Heidi's story she was just telling. We have some great video and pictures there as well. So we've got it covered between the two of us, right? ABC 15 and KTAR News. And we're going to be back and kind of wrap up a little bit about what we've learned today.
A lot to talk about.
And we still have a lot more to talk about in the time remaining here. You're listening to a roundtable between KTAR and ABC 15, talking to our reporters that spent 48 hours on the border. And I hope you'll stick with us. Thank you.
KTAR News 92.3 FM and the KTAR News app.
Good afternoon. I'm Jayme West from Arizona's Morning News on KTAR. And joining me is ABC15 News anchor Javier Soto. And our stations, they teamed up to bring you a unique look at the border crisis, sending teams of reporters to Arizona's southernmost regions for 48 hours. You've been hearing and watching their stories all week, and for the past 2 hours, hearing more from those reporters as we dig a little deeper. And I don't know, I maybe we should send a copy of this to every single one of our politicians. Because if they can't spend 48 hours on the border, we'll let them hear from people who did.
And that was one of the things that we heard time and time again from politicians in Douglas, as well as residents, saying, don't come down here and take a picture. Spend 48 hours on the border. Learn what's really going on here. And more importantly, get back to Washington and fix it. They're frustrated. They're all frustrated, even in Douglas, Arizona, where we're not seeing the floods of migrants roaming the streets and the problems that we've seen in other border towns. But they say it takes away from some of their resources, and some of the residents complained it takes away from their tourism, where they're trying to build back their town, but people are afraid to come to Douglas.
You know, and we have, as we've been promoting this roundtable all week, I had somebody who follows me on social media, and I'm sorry, my voice is about to give out. I've been talking since very early this morning. So I'll just tell you a little bit about her story. She has a relative whose mother owns a market and a beautiful large house and pasture land in this tiny, picturesque village that's on a highway that the cartels use to come to Arizona. So mom is elderly in poor health. She has come here legally on a visa to stay with her daughter, and as they take care of her. But in this tiny little village, the cartel has been slowly taking over abandoned houses, trying to take over her market. They have hired people to try and protect her property and her market and keep the business going. But they're very, very worried about, you know, is she going to have anything to go back to? You know, who is taking over this small town, this little village? And the cartels are trying to.
And I know Heidi touched on it briefly. She's the county supervisor mentioned something to the effect, this is not out of control, because it is being controlled. Maybe not by us,
right,
but it's being controlled by the cartel. And speaking with Jim Cross about his visit to that ranch, the rancher said the same thing. I'm a tough 80-something-year-old cowboy, but he's concerned about the cartel, and he says his ranch is surrounded by cartel and feels that people are constantly watching him and watching movement, and they're the ones telling the people, dropping them off right there and saying, hey, you know, Phoenix or Tucson, right up the road, you go down there, when in actuality, you're talking days away if they were to go by foot.
And protecting the border is securing the border and figuring out some kind of solution to this. It isn't going to happen in a day. It isn't probably going to happen in the next week or month, maybe even a year, but something has to be done, because for years and years, we've been hearing it from political leaders in Arizona, other southern border states, that the federal government isn't doing their job. They've had a long time to try and figure this out. But obviously the solution is not simple.
One of our Scripps reporters took a deep dive into that. This is not a problem that just happened. He went back to George W. Bush. He went back to the late Senator John McCain and how many attempts he tried for immigration reform, and it failed time and time again. Nick Saletti, he was talking about his time in Yuma 15 years ago. Same issue, and they're still dealing with it. So it kind of gives you a broader scope of there's been a problem, maybe not to what it escalated in December when we saw those record-breaking surges, but this is an ongoing issue. At some point, they have to fix it. Every 4 years, every 2 years during an election, it can't be the topic if you're not fixing it.
Is there ever any going back to what it was like before?
I don't know.
The stories that we've heard from the people who've lived there for generations?
I doubt that. I doubt that. You know, they were talking decades later where these gentlemen who were veterans and talked about how the peacefulness and how they would cross the border and there wasn't a fence. I think those times are long behind us, possibly because of the cartel, right? And they control that. And they are a well-operated machine. They know what they're doing. In fact, when we were in Douglas, one of the gentlemen was telling us there's a row of houses that face the border. And they said that those were all, and this is not verified, this is from somebody telling us this, but those were all owned by the cartel. And they control what happens on both sides of the border.
You know, we're not going to find the answers today, but boy, I sure feel more informed. I feel, and I hope you do too, if you've been listening to this past 2 hours, that you feel a little bit more familiar about what is actually happening along the border and how it's affecting not only Arizonans, but the people who live and work along the border on the Mexican side as well. And I really appreciate your joining us. This has been a roundtable with ABC 15's Javier Soto. I'm Jayme West from Arizona's Morning News, discussing 48 hours on the border. And if you want to check out more about these stories, see videos and pictures, you can do that at KTAR.com.
ABC15.com/border.
Thanks so much, Javier.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on KTAR.